Schubert, officer, traveler, military, and naval analyst, discusses today's news developments and what they mean in the future world strategy of the war. Paul Schubert is presented every evening, Monday through Friday at this time, by Virginia Round Cigarettes, created by Benson & Hedges, 5th Avenue, New York. This is the superb cigarette that gives you 54% more prized light golden Virginia tobaccos than any ordinary brand. These fine cigarettes are made both with plain ends and corn tips. If you like the plain ends better, insist that you get them. Both styles are clearly marked on the bottom of the package. And now, Paul Schubert.
Thank you, Ford Bond. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is one of those nights when Europe is swept by alarms and rumors. The events of recent weeks have thrown the continent into a state of instability. Once more, people have the feeling that anything can happen. In Italy and also in Germany, there is particular tension. Feelings like these have been part of the European air for years. It's a little hard to appreciate, here in the United States, just how unstable Europe is to the present generation. For just about 30 years now, Europeans have been living in an atmosphere of war, revolution, political crisis. They've seen the forms of government change. The national flag has changed and changed again. Their money has changed in shape, appearance, and value, and changed again. The names of their cities have changed, and the names of streets inside the cities. Things like defeat, inflation, and currency revaluation have made all property values uncertain. The constant threat of war and the repeated experience of war have made human relationships painful and tragic as families have been torn apart. At the start of these 30 years, war was confined to battlefields. Now it has become a universal experience in which any city may be bombed. Hamburg, Berlin, Rome, any building blasted to rubble, with or without warning. As a result, Europeans now find violence and change the normal thing. That's one reason why the Germans followed Hitler, who was a man of violence. Hitler preached a rule of violence, said he was going to set up a government so strong that it would last 1,000 years, that its strength would reach out and swallow up most of the rest of Europe and a good deal of the outer world. The Germans accepted Hitler's violence as a sort of inverted stability. To them, the tread of stormtroopers' boots, the purges and assassinations, the race persecutions seemed the lesser of two evils. They thought the alternative was anarchy and repeated internal collapse. They thought Hitler would give them a government that endured. But Hitler led them into war, and though for a time he gave them victories, ultimately a time came when the tide turned, and now instinctively the Germans realize that a greater force has arisen and is pressing inward toward Germany. On the Russian front, they see the Russian armies, recovered from earlier defeats, advancing kilometer by kilometer, pressing the Germans back. In Western Germany, they see the terrible destruction wrought by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force, bombing which has laid great cities waste, though the Germans were promised that the German Luftwaffe would see to it that Germany was never damaged from the air. In the south, too, there's defeat. Defeat in two forms. Perhaps the Germans expected that. They've never thought much of the Italians as fighters, fought stoutly on many fields since this war began. The Italian defeats were followed by the first step of Italian political collapse at home. It's likely that the Germans didn't expect that, because it strikes too near home to them. Here's a totalitarian government, and under pressure it collapses as easily as a party government after a parliamentary defeat. Mussolini's downfall shook the Germans back into the old sense of instability. I say that as a fact, not based on knowledge in the day's news, but based on knowledge of Europe. And the second form of defeat there in the Mediterranean, the defeat of German armies, not by Russians, not by air bombing, but in combat against British, American, and French troops. After the downfall of Mussolini, the Germans' government of Badoglio and King Victor Emmanuel, the so-called constitutional government, because they thought it meant an improvement in the situation, a stiffening of Italy's fighting ability. Now the analogy is clear. Perhaps we ought to pitch Hitler and the Nazi Party overboard. They've brought us a lot of trouble, war and sacrifice, and now defeat on all fronts. This thought may not even have taken concrete form as yet, but it's in the air. And it's reflected tonight in the European news, which is full of vague rumors of important non-military developments in Germany. Rigid German censorship is stopping all dispatches which speak specifically as to what such developments might be. For my part, I wouldn't put any stock in specific rumors anyway, because there's no limit to the things people conjure up and spread about as fact there in Europe at times like these. And when dramatic events come, they come unannounced and usually with complete surprise, as Mussolini's downfall came a few days ago. The point is, the political tide has turned, as well as the military, in this great total war, and for the same reason, because of the pressure of the arms of the United Nations. All this applies, however, only to the European civilian populations, not to the European armies, not even to the Italian army. There's a reason for that, too. The armies don't hear the news. Above all, they don't hear the foreign shortwave news that reaches the civilian population by radio. And the armies are under much tighter organization. And the armies are, on the whole, much better clothed and fed, except on the active combat fronts, than the civil population. And often better housed, too. So that the armies must still be considered as intact, as fighting units determined to carry on the war. This is particularly true of the German army, which has fought through these difficult weeks without showing any signs of cracking. There's one more thing to remember. All this happened before, this home front uneasiness, back in 1918. Then, too, the armies were relatively untouched politically, but then the home front situation got completely out of hand and led to political turmoil that spread through the military, and there was both military and political collapse under the pressure of arms. This time, the authorities are much more alive to the potentialities of home front uneasiness and revolt, more determined to suppress such tendencies by violence. The Badoglio government in Italy may actually turn out to be more violent than Mussolini and his fascisti. And if, in Germany, Hitler should be thrown out in favor of a military dictatorship, that dictatorship would certainly set out to rule the country with absolute martial authoritarianism. I beg your pardon. What we are seeing now is the war's real crisis. Under pressure, Europe's hard-pressed civilians are wavering, but this wavering has been anticipated. The European military men who are at bottom responsible for this war, the men who backed Hitler and Mussolini, and who may throw Hitler over as they threw Mussolini over, those men are ruthless and determined and will stop at nothing in this critical year of the United Nations' first offensive. At all costs, those men want to avoid defeat. If they can't win the war, they want to win the peace. They want to force us to accept a draw, and in the years after the war, they want to prepare for a military comeback. That's why suddenly the phrase unconditional surrender begins to assume such importance. They say the idea of unconditional surrender hurts Italian pride. They should have thought of that when they began waging war on Albanians and Greeks, Abyssinians and French, and when they cheered the Italian declaration of war on the United States. Next to the day's military events and their strategic meaning. I'll continue with an analysis of the various fronts in just a moment. And now Ford Bond has a word for you on what might happen if all the cigarettes in America were placed end to end.
Well, as soon as you compare the ends of cigarettes, it's just logical to select Virginia rounds. And here's why this is true. The secret of lightness and flavor in a cigarette is the precious light golden Virginia tobacco it contains. Experts agree the more Virginia, the more smoking pleasure. Well, compare the end of a Virginia round with the end of any ordinary cigarette. The ordinary cigarette is brown and dark in color. Perhaps it has faint shreds of golden Virginia. The end of a Virginia round is light glorious golden, the color of Virginia tobacco. Proof before your eyes that Virginia rounds give you more of this prized tobacco. Yes, you get 54% more than in any ordinary brand. So treat yourself to the finest. Switch to the cigarette that assures you the utmost in smoking enjoyment. Virginia rounds. And remember, if you like plain ends better, insist on getting them. When you buy, just look at the bottom of the package to see whether they're corn tips or plain ends. Thank you. And now, back to Paul Schubert.
On Sicily, we've got the enemy moving back, and we are following up the advantage fighting to hand out the finishing punch. A point of stubborn German resistance is at Troina, where they are defending the road leading to Randazzo and thence to Messina. At the north, American troops captured Galliano in an advance of 2 to 3 miles. There's been hard fight Canadians and British in the center, too. And on the right, the British are pushing up the coast road beyond Catania. The terrain of this Axis last stand on Sicily is very rugged. It's terrain that favors defense, since the only lines of advance run through the valleys and roads can be effectively mined and blocked. All this handicaps the use of armor and of mechanized equipment. On the other hand, the enemy has literally no air support, and the power of our concentrated air attack increases as the Germans plus their Italian supporters are jammed into smaller and smaller space. Apart from using our air against enemy troops and front positions, we have given Messina a heavy bombing using big American flying fortresses. And that, I think, is eloquent of the situation. The enemy can do nothing like that to us. On the Russian front, the dominant fact in the situation is the Russian breakthrough at Oryol and Belgorod. A large-scale German retreat is on, and there is some indication that the Germans may fall back all the way to the line of the Dnieper River. The point is this. Here we are in August. The first week of August is almost gone. If the Germans make a determined stand where they are, on a front whose main props has been knocked out at Oryol, they may check the Russian advance, or at least slow it. But there is danger that August will become September, and then October will be followed by November, and the Germans will find themselves fighting in the open, as they were last year before Stalingrad, with a Russian winter offensive coming up, and Germans succumbing to cold as well as to bullets. Whereas if the Germans conduct a deliberate retreat during the next 4 to 6 weeks, fighting rearguard actions as they go, and set up a new line further west, they will not only have made their supply problem much easier and their lines shorter, but they may be better prepared for the winter warfare. But other events may have something to say of all this. There is in all likelihood a new British-American plan developing in the Western European theater, and that plan may have great bearing upon future events in Russia. And the Russians, too, will have a lot to say about developments. Just now, the Russians are pushing on beyond Oryol and Belgorod in a number of columns. They have captured the town of Kromy, southwest of Oryol, and they're apparently closing on Kharkov. This Russian offensive is one of the war's big developments. Out in the southwest Pacific, the conquest of Munda has been completed at last, fought out by the slow but certain process of killing the Japanese defenders. As for the elimination of Japanese troops, that has some importance, but what is more important, at Munda we gain an airdrome. When it's repaired, we shall have a landing strip something like 4,000 feet long, and that means we have extended our air power another step closer to the Japanese enemy, closer to Rabaul. This extension of our air power is an asset that will be reflected in future campaigning. But locally, there at Munda, after we have cleaned up the few individual Japanese troops that may still be in hiding on New Georgia, we will have the further tasks of cleaning up Bairoko and Vila. From Munda to Troina to Kharkov, the war goes on. Thank you. Our sponsor, Benson & Hedges, has a message for smokers.
Today, people are no longer content that smoking should be just a humdrum habit. That's why Virginia Rounds are making so many new friends. They make smoking a delightful experience. Here's why. All popular cigarettes contain some Virginia tobacco, the key to flavor, delicious aroma, in fact, to smoking delight. The more Virginia, the more smoking pleasure. Well, Virginia Rounds are 54% richer in prized golden Virginia tobacco than any ordinary brand. No wonder they changed smoking from a thing you have to do to an adventure in pleasure. Try Virginia Rounds. Paul Schubert will be back with another analysis of military and naval developments at this same time Monday night. This is Ford Bond, speaking for Virginia Rounds, America's most distinguished cigarette, wishing you good smoking and good evening.